This lecture will continue to look at the developments in Florence during the High Renaissance and also the transition into Mannerism, specifically focusing on the great works by Michelangelo such as his David. Now, as noted, we're going to be transitioning now from the monumentality and self-assurance that we see in the High Renaissance, in examples such as the David, to this type of anxiety and this response that we see, especially in Italy, to the Protestant Reformation, and a return to this kind of graceful elegance, also inspired by Neoplatonism with Mannerism. Now we know that Michelangelo is very different than his other contemporaries. He will be fiercely loyal to Florence, both in a civic and in a religious sense, that being any pope or outside force that threatened the Florentine Republic, Michelangelo would defend or he would refuse to cooperate or work with that individual. And that includes Julius II. Now, by the time Leonardo returns in 1500 from Milan to Florence during his travels after the fall of the Archduchy of Milan in 1499. Michelangelo was already a formidable rival at this time, having completed many commissions in Rome and received those in Florence as well. Now, Buonarroti is going to be the opposite of Leonardo da Vinci in many ways. He is staunchly political and Catholic. He is a believer, unlike Leonardo, who doubts everything. And he is obsessed, given his Catholic faith, with guilt, and writes repeatedly and longingly to be relieved of it throughout his life, questioning whether or not he would be saved or was worthy of God's salvation in poems and letters at the end of his life. We know he also will scorn landscape and is going to prefer sculpture to painting, and even states that he is a sculptor, not a painter. Now we have nearly 75 years of production, not his life alone, but of production itself. Therefore, it was impossible to escape the influence of Michelangelo during the Cinquecento or the 16th century. All of these artists were comparing themselves to him, especially after the publication of Giorgio Vasari's Le Vite, or his Lives, in 1550, and the expanded version in 1568, where Vasari heralds Michelangelo as the greatest artist to have ever lived. Now we know that Michelangelo, unlike Leonardo, is primarily interested in the human figure. He does not put a lot of effort into landscape. And supposedly he does carry out dissections, we are told, like Leonardo, though not nearly as many. And he did wish to become an author of a treatise on anatomy, we are told by his biographers. Now, Michelangelo was born to a governor of Caprese under Florence's control at the time in their contado. His father had an aristocratic name, therefore he was quite pretentious, even though the family was impoverished and perennially penniless. Now, the idea that his son would take on a job associated with manual labor was very upsetting to his father here. Now, he moved to Settignano, where Michelangelo was going to be given to a wet nurse, which is customary for aristocrats, especially aristocratic women who wanted to maintain the physique of someone who has not breastfed. And so if you are of means, you will give that over to a wet nurse for your child to feed. Now, from early on, we are told, according to Michelangelo, as he tells his biographers, that he drinks in the hammer and the chisel, as he calls it, from his wet nurse, because she was married to a stonecutter in a village of stonecutters and quarrymen. Now, Michelangelo, again unlike Leonardo, believed in the superiority of sculpture over painting, and stated that the nearer painting approaches relief, the better it is. A very different approach than the atmospheric elements that Leonardo wished to capture. And certainly Michelangelo will never be as interested in the atmospheric veil, and even using oil painting for that matter to capture these effects. He instead appreciated frescoing. Now, his desire to become an artist was violently opposed by his father, who beat him anytime he asked to be apprenticed. Given that he was from a noble line, even though they had no money, he stated, his father did at least, that they were above manual labor, that a sculptor especially is going to have a difficult time arguing that he does not work with his hands. That is the definition of a sculptor. Following his commissions in Rome, Michelangelo returned to Florence, where he's going to produce the only preserved panel painting made entirely by his own hand, without the assistance of any of his students or pupils. This is known as the Doni Madonna, and it is going to be a tondo, or a circular painting, a very specific type in Florence, and produced for a very particular reason. In this, we are celebrating the 1503 wedding of Angelo Doni, and he's going to be marrying Maddalena Doni. We will look at the portraits painted by Raphael as an example of these types of marriage portraits that change at the turn of the century. We no longer are only going to commission images of women once they have died, or posthumous images. Instead, we celebrate them while they are alive, and especially on the occasions of a wedding and the birth of a male child. Now here we're going to have the Holy Family providing over the new couple's conjugal life. Or it could also possibly record the death of one of their children, specifically a male child is what this possibly could be. The bright colors, of course, seen after it is cleaned, are very striking to modern audiences and foretell the Sistine Chapel. Now, a tondo is going to be a circular painting, which we looked at examples of, like Fra Filippo Lippi, where they're going to be commissioned on the occasion of a wedding and the birth, specifically of a male child, that carries on the family name. Now, the subjects of these tondi often are going to show children and or childbirth, thus showing with a wedding the purpose of a wedding, which you would hang in a conjugal area, is to produce children and or the celebration that a child has been born. Now the design, much like we looked at earlier with Michelangelo's Pietà, is going to have these intertwined figures seemingly seated on each other's laps, but instead they are now compressed and coiled into a spring, whereby you find the action and the potential for moving these figures back and forth and orienting them in opposite directions communicates the potential for action and powerful, violent motion. So here, the composition, which would otherwise, with these bright colors, and the Virgin who's going to be twisting her body in a contorted fashion, looking back up at her child, that is going to be held by Saint Joseph, right? So this twisting, spiraling motion of a coiled spring is anchored by the stone horizontal slab in the background, thus, of course, showing you the tension between the two varieties of compositions and elements that Michelangelo was known for, the stability and quiet contemplative composition versus the active and violent motions that often are going to be seen. In the background, importantly, we're going to have unmodeled random nude figures. These have nothing to do with the subjects in the foreground, even though in the right-hand side we have a young Saint John the Baptist seen in Leonardo's examples and cartoons. The male nudes have no bearing and no precedent in a Holy Family image. They foretell the mastery demonstrated in his anatomical knowledge in random nude male figures in the Sistine Chapel as well. Now the bright colors which contrast with these pinks and greens, oranges and blues, they're going to foretell the colors that are used in the Sistine Chapel and that have these very sculpted, modeled forms like sculpture. They come out and are almost chiseled as these forms are volumetrically solid and are offset by the bright coloration of the garments worn by the Holy Family. Perhaps his most famous work, we look at the Madonna of the Harpies here by Andrea del Sarto, where we find many references again to the High Renaissance works in Rome of Raphael. In the painting, we have the Madonna and Child standing on a pedestal, being embraced by putti, or angels, at their feet, with Saints John the Evangelist and Saint Francis flanking them on either side, in a traditional pyramidal composition seen throughout the High Renaissance. Below, the namesake of the painting comes from these relief sculptures of harpies, which reference ancient art as well as the notion of them being psychopompoi, or those figures that help souls into the afterlife, just as the Madonna and Child and saints would act as psychopompoi and help us into the afterlife as we pray to them throughout our lives and on our deathbed. They will help us like the harpies here. The work references Raphael several times, not only in the specific pose of St. John the Evangelist here to the right, who lifts his right leg in this elegant twisting contrapposto pose from the philosopher in the school of Athens, but Raphael himself had also reused the pose for Galatea. And so reusing specific works and figures is not necessarily in the Mannerist idiom. It is how it is used. The painting that the Madonna of the Harpies most closely references is in fact Raphael's Sistine Madonna, where we find a central vision of the Madonna and Child, flanked by two angels below and two saints to their sides. Now, in it, we have the twisting of two different saints, again, the more feminine and beautiful of them to the right, as with St. Barbara and the Sistine Madonna, and the older bearded one to the left. The shoulders also twisting in opposite directions, as we're going to be moving around and around the image, with the St. Francis shouldering, again, this foreshortened direction, looking out at us, as we move around the image towards St. John the Evangelist, up to the Madonna and Child, and down again around the angels at their feet, twisting and turning around this central vertical axis, just as we see in the Sistine Madonna and was also used in his Galatea. The same monumental figures and proportions are used along with the balanced symmetry, where we can draw a line down the middle of each one of these paintings and fold them over. There is bilateral symmetry, organizing them, making them clear and concise with a pyramidal composition. The motion in the figures are going to be idealized, yet the sculptural component is going to be derived from Michelangelo. Here, if we look at the faces of the Madonna here and the Madonna of the Harpies versus the Sistine Madonna, we see the same soft, simplistic, and almost doll-like features, with the button nose, the pursed lips, and the almond-shaped eyes. Now, Andrea is going to often base his women on his wife as a model, showing us that he is still interested in recording how things appear in nature and idealizing from there. The influence of Raphael is of course palpable here with the Madonna of the Harpies, but the pyramidal composition found its way into other altarpieces in Florence, as we were discussing with the massive altarpiece to Saint Anne that's going to be in San Marco. Now, the sculptural quality, seen especially in the shoulder of St. Francis and the twisting form of St. John the Evangelist, is going to show the influence of Michelangelo, whose Doni Madonna and other paintings were still in Florence. Now, what we find here, as far as Andrea del Sarto's personal sense of harmony, relates more so to a kind of melancholic sweetness, seen especially in the Virgin and St. Francis' face, to where they seem beautiful and at ease and calm and graceful, yet somehow a sadness settles over their forms and their gaze as they look downward. Now, in his approach to composition, Del Sarto is definitely indebted to the simplistic compositions that are balanced by a type of poise and counterpoise with each one of the figures, thus making it interesting and activated to look at. We have the potential for motion, yet the figures remain still. The qualities of the High Renaissance carried on here. Now, in the High Renaissance, we have a style that we've been discussing that is idealized, grand, simplified, and inspiring, that used classical compositions derived from the principles of antiquity, that had the most important element and focal point of a work in the center, that balanced it along a vertical axis, ensuring its bilateral symmetry. But after 1520, artists began questioning or defying these ideals outright. Mannerism, or from the Italian word maniera, for style or something that is heavy-handed, we have the style following the High Renaissance, one that values sophistication and artificiality, and a further refinement that is not along the same uniform guidelines as the High Renaissance. And this style will differ in different regions of Italy. So this class will focus on what happens in Florence after the departure of Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael, next time turning our attention northward to Parma and these northern areas. Now, the High Renaissance that we talked about is certainly based on the study of nature. These artists in Julius II's employ would take live models, posing them in the position they wished for them to finally be seen in. Now, they're going to abandon this approach following the High Renaissance. So after the High Renaissance, and what will become known as the Late Renaissance, we now look for our examples not in nature, but in art. We look to the earlier old masters, the frescoes of Raphael and Michelangelo, and we begin copying them. The artfulness based on the artifice, elegance, and sophistication with which we can suggest through interpictoriality these earlier examples, looking back to and referencing in new works these previous old master paintings. Now, Mannerism is going to very self-consciously break with the High Renaissance ideals just mentioned, and have nervous crowds, spasmodic rhythms, irrational spatial structure, and an overall avoidance of symmetry and unity that defines the rational style of Raphael and Michelangelo. We see that very clearly here in Santa Felicita in Florence, which of course is also, as we discussed with the Pitti Palace, the walkway that you can see here on the second story connecting the Uffizi to the Pitti Palace, so that the Medici dukes could walk above the street without fear of assassination. Inside of Santa Felicita, immediately to your right, you have a very important chapel. This chapel, of course, now redecorated in the Baroque style, as seen here with the barrel vaults and the Pietra Serena stone, is going to show Pontormo's descent from the cross. Now, the Capponi chapel is going to be centered around an Annunciation scene off to the right with the altar, but the massive altarpiece is one of an example that breaks very specifically with the High Renaissance on multiple levels. Here we're going to see the Annunciation and the typological association at the incarnation of Christ, or the beginning of his life, foretelling the end of his life, or the fulfillment and promise of resurrection towards the end with the descent from the cross. The figures are going to be wearing billowing diaphanous drapery, very colorfully clad, and are going to very elegantly be positioned with these contrapposto poses, the angel Gabriel floating in space here as though he is aloft, getting ready to greet the Virgin Mary and announce to her that she would give birth to the Son of God. Above, we find 4 roundels painted with the images or author portraits from the Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Here we have St. Luke, the patron saint of painters, who's going to be writing with a feather-quilled pen, with the image of his symbol, the bull, behind him to the back right, in the shadowy nebulous area. The distortive quality of the elongated limbs and the fact that the figure seeks the frame comes from the studies that Pontormo made with convex mirrors that would distort and push out the form, allowing him to experiment with these new elongated and rather graceful figures. In preparatory drawings for this work, we know that he had originally included a ladder near the cloud, thus giving us an indication as to where we were in the Passion of Christ and his narrative at the end of his life, that being he had just been taken off the cross. However, this deposition gave way to this descent in this instance to where we don't really know where we are and what's happening. We have a very slow circular motion and a dreamlike, unreal quality as we are continuously moving cyclically. Now, the High Renaissance version of the entombment can be seen here with Raphael, where very clearly we are moving from right to left. From the background in the right, we can see Golgotha and the ladder from which Christ was taken off the cross. They are now moving him with great effort to the tomb to the left here, as the Virgin Mary faints to the right. The point in the narrative to which we are at, indicated by Raphael, is completely absent in Pontormo. Instead, where are we taking Christ? From whence is he derived? Where are we going? None of these questions are answered by what is in the image. For we have a shroud, this green shroud in the foreground, but are they about to wrap him in it? Are they taking him out of it? Where is the cross? Where is the tomb? All we have in the background is going to be a single cloud. We do not know where we are in relationship to Golgotha. Comparing this to a very similar scene we just looked at, the Lamentation by Andrea del Sarto, we should note that we do not have a central focal point as would be demanded in a classical painting. Instead, the center here of Pontormo's work is a series of hands that are overlapping. The figures are going to seek the frame, being pushed out in a circular fashion, whereby we do not even have a logical organization of space. For Christ seemingly is being taken towards us, with the figure closest to us, given his frame is closest to the frame, right in the center. But he moves back into space, as does Mary Magdalene, dressed in pink here, moving towards the Virgin Mary, who faints backwards as well. There is no way that Christ's body could be positioned in this way, because of course the lower part of his body, which should be closer to us, the viewer, is foreshortened away from us, whereas the upper part of his torso appears closer but cannot be, for the angel dressed in blue, his feet are further back in space. This, of course, is going to indicate a perpetual cyclical motion. Unlike that of Raphael and these earlier designs in the High Renaissance, which were anchored around a central, stable vertical axis, there is nothing around which this is going to center. It does not move parallel to the ground or perpendicular to the picture plane. Instead, the figures are compressed and stacked up. There is very little negative space. It is squeezed out. So we have a rhythmic motion that moves cyclically around and around with pastel cuts taken from the distortive qualities seen in mirrors, like we looked at on the four gospel writers above, as well as jarring color combinations and desaturation modeling that he derived from the Sistine Chapel ceiling, seen especially in the figure holding Christ's legs, who will have a golden tunic, a pink back, and a bright blue torso in the front. These coming from desaturation modeling, whereby we do not model with black or white, but instead with different color combinations, using again blues and yellows and oranges as opposed to black and white. This giving us the shimmering incandescence of a serpent and or scales. Even when we think about the figures that would have been designed for, say, a flood or a deluge, we know that even in his designs, Pontormo is going to produce interlocking figural groups, squeezing out the negative space, yet gingerly and gracefully interlocking the figures one to the next in this perpetual dance-like ballet. The last artist we'll discuss is Giovanni Battista di Jacopo, otherwise known by his nickname of Rosso Fiorentino, literally the red-headed Florentine, because he was red-headed, which is very unusual for an Italian. So we find that this becomes his nickname because his appearance stands out. Now, he was determined to stray radically from the harmony of the High Renaissance, and in his biography written by Giorgio Vasari, Vasari will always include character sketches which help us understand the style of these individuals. And he tells us that he will use a pet monkey to torment the monks of Santa Croce. The mischievousness of this pet monkey is carried out in many of his commissions, which are going to violate propriety and Renaissance decorum. The final painting we'll look at is his Moses defending the daughters of Jethro. This is going to be a very unusual subject and a very small painting. It's less than a foot high, showing Moses, the Old Testament patriarch, defending the daughters of Jethro from the Midianites who attempt to kidnap them. Now, the color scheme is very bright and cheerful, which contrasts with the brutal subject matter we're seeing here in the hand-to-hand combat of Moses beating this rival tribe so they cannot take away the daughters of Israel. Now, the image and positioning of Moses, who is straddling these nude figures of 4 Midianites below him, is taken from David and Goliath in the Sistine Chapel, as David appears to deliver the death blow at Goliath's neck. So this is a precedent. However, it also looks to the brazen serpent with these piled up forms, a very radical anti-classical composition that also references the Laocoon, something that many Renaissance artists would love to reference. However, it's going to take the very traditional pyramidal composition that has been the staple of Renaissance artists and will turn it on its head. For there is no negative space, and so therefore the pyramidal composition loses its compositional effectiveness. We cannot move back into space gently with rolling hills, a city, or atmospheric perspective. Instead, we have a mass of figures that have nearly the same tonality and hue in the foreground collapsing into the same plane. And we're also going to be moving in a contradictory fashion. For looking at the image, we are drawn to the fist of Moses that's going to be leveled at this Midianite's face, of which he grabs onto his shoulder. This draws our eye down and away from the center of the composition. But at the same time, behind him, we have another Midianite wearing a very bright, warm hue that is billowing about him, obviously drawing our attention to him, who runs, who sprints as fast as he can from left to right, threatening this bare-breasted daughter of Jethro, who, like a doll, is left hopeless and vulnerable. So we have this irreconcilable tension between the violence done to the Midianites by Moses and the potential violence that could be done to these women in the background. This, of course, continuing the jarring juxtapositions we looked at earlier, starting off with Pontormo. While there, he comes across many more examples of ancient Roman architecture, sculpture, and painting than he would have ever had access to in Florence, and it is immediately influential for him. And he receives commissions while there when he applies these new influences. One such commission is the Bacchus of 1496 to 97, which was created for a Roman patron while he was in the city traveling to see the Borgia Pope and the Great Collection. In the image, we see a renewed sensuous languor and sensuality and a new type of realism associated with his work, modeled on either the Praxitelean style or the Apollo Belvedere. Here, the god Bacchus, or the god of wine, is going to be identified as he's carrying a kylix cup used to fill wine with in antiquity, wearing grapevines and grapes on his head, as a satyr jealously and sinisterly tries to steal them as Bacchus is too inebriated to know the difference. The softness of the torso and the fleshiness is going to be adopted once he has access to the ancient statuary collection, like that in the Belvedere, whereas the additional layer of fascia adds a type of eroticism to the form unknown in Michelangelo's oeuvre prior to this point. Now we know that with the eyes, now in the collection of the Bargello Museum in Florence, his eyes are glazed over. He's going to lurch unsteadily forward, and his abdomen is going to sag as though he is drunk and unable or unaware of the fact that he is not flexing. Behind him, we notice a mischievous satyr is going to be grabbing the grapes from him, eating them, obviously, while Bacchus is unaware given his intoxication. The grapes are going to fall from appropriately a panther skin, identifying this Near Eastern god, who is a late arrival in addition to the Greek and Roman pantheons, where we find a boy satyr, which is always shown as mischievous, is going to be grabbing it, smiling in this fashion. So we looked at Botticelli's Venus and Mars, where the same type of mischievous satyrs are going to be shown, whereas not quite an adult. We have a playfulness associated with a figure that, as an adult, would represent raw, unbridled male libido and libidinous energy and power. Now, as a child, is a mischievous adolescent. Now, in 1501, Pierre de Rohan is going to commission a copy of Donatello's David in order to be taken to France. This is a Frenchman. Now, the commission has been lost, but does show us, and is captured in drawings, that Michelangelo is very aware of Donatello's David, especially since he lived in the Medici Palazzo for a number of years in his youth, and certainly would have copied it there as well, given that it was in the courtyard and the first thing you saw when entering the Medici household. This knowledge is also going to be carried on in that he would have also seen the earlier Donatello David that was produced for the cathedral, but was far too small to be seen from a sharply foreshortened angle below. The massive and monumental sculptures that are designed here would have had an example from Michelangelo had it been placed in the position it had originally been intended. Now, today, you will find a copy in the Piazza della Signoria of one of his most famous statues that the Italians nickname Il Gigante. This is Michelangelo's David, following the Florentine tradition from the earlier examples by Donatello and then by Verrocchio. Examples can be seen in the Bargello Museum in Florence, where we also have his Bacchus. But the copy is going to be in front of the Palazzo Vecchio. The original David, if you want to see it, is in the Accademia. Now, the marble that Michelangelo was given to complete this massive monumental statue was a 17-foot tall block left over from an earlier commission. Now, the block was tall but very shallow, therefore it restricted the projection that Michelangelo could have the figure in and how the limbs would be positioned. They needed to be largely in profile, and the contrapposto could not be very exaggerated. Now, originally, this was meant to be seen from a sharply foreshortened angle from below. And given his faith in giudizio dell'occhio, or the judgment of the eye, he's going to distort the figure so that it can be easily seen from below. And the optical distortions would be corrected, much like Donatello's Saint Mark when it originally was rejected. But he set it in the niche it was intended to be seen in, and then the patrons are going to accept it. Now, once it was finished, there was a commission established in Florence to decide where exactly should this monumental statue go, because it was so beloved by the Florentines and so celebrated. So we find this commission included, among others, Filippino Lippi, Botticelli, Leonardo, Piero di Cosimo, and others. For instance, Leonardo wanted it to be seen in the Loggia della Signoria, otherwise known as the Loggia dei Lanzi, which is an open-air sculpture garden that now holds many Mannerist examples. In this sculpture garden, it would have been seen, among others, these early Renaissance examples like Donatello's Judith and Holofernes. Instead, they decided to place it on and in front of the Palazzo Vecchio as a symbol of the Florentine Republic, much like Donatello had a symbol of the Florentine Republic in his David. Now, when it was set in place, Piero Soderini, who was elected to preserve the freedom of Florence from the Medici, and especially after the tumultuous short reign of Savonarola, he is quite prudish, and so he has it fitted with a brass girdle, and so you cannot see anything, much like the massive statue that recently was made in copy of David and sent to Japan. They put boxers over him. Now, as a symbol of the Florentine Republic and not of the Medici, it was attacked repeatedly by Medici supporters, protesting their exile once again. In 1527 as well, there was a revolt, and a bench was thrown out of a window from the Palazzo Vecchio and shattered the left arm that Vasari is going to have rescued as a child and hid, only later to give it to Cosimo I de' Medici as a symbol for the Medici again. To give you an idea of scale, here is a conservator working on the David, and this is going to make it even more obvious where the crack is in the broken wrist and section that shattered as part of this revolt. Now, in the 19th century, the statue is going to be moved to the Accademia, where it is going to be preserved, and we have a central rotunda built just for it, with a skylight illuminating the David, and you are still not allowed to take photographs on the interior today. That's why these should not, of course, exist. But we find here, as an example, the massive Accademia, which is still a functioning art institute and school, is going to use this to showcase the greatest artists to ever live in Florence and to show students what they should be copying. Now, the figure of David, this commanding presence of over life size, nearly 3 times the scale of an average man, is going to show the young hero nude. Thus, the pretext for that is going to be that Saul offers his armor to the young David to fight Goliath the giant, and he says that no, God will protect him, that his faith is going to allow him to overcome. Therefore, he is nude. In this case, holding the rock that would crush Goliath's skull in his right hand, you can see it here, while slinging the slingshot over his left shoulder and eyeing the horizon, turning dramatically to his left, looking off into the distance. The rock is visible from the hand, very carefully carved as well, with veins and protruding bones, carefully observed, a monumental sculpture, carefully polished in this way. The statue illustrates, when compared to Donatello's David, who remember is a mere 5 feet 2 inches tall, a life-size rendition of this young boy who's too young to go into battle. Now, compared to the monumental Il Gigante of Michelangelo, he's also going to be older and more muscular and more fit and ready for action and violent conflict. And this is the difference between the early Renaissance and the High Renaissance, right? The carefully closed off and internally considered closed composition seen with Donatello is going to find a counterpart in the outward-looking, muscular, and monumental figure of Michelangelo, showing with his monumental heroic nudity that he is psychologically engaged in something outside of himself, but still comprehensible from one viewing angle. We can still draw a line all the way around the closed form that is going to be contained within him. Now, even a close-up of the figures' faces will show you the difference in their comportment and psychological disposition. Donatello's David is looking down, lost in thought, shown after the conflict with Goliath, after he has cut off his head, decapitating him with his own sword. The psychological cross-referencing is even more noticeable when you look at the David straight on, for his eyes wander looking off to the left, his brow furrowed. Considering the battle ahead, we know that he is engaged in something outside of himself, considering what is about to happen. Now, his hair is also very significant, for it's going to comment on the Renaissance natural science of physiognomy, that being they believed that your facial features and your proportions of your body and your hair all said something about and was revealing towards your personality. Now, this generally, especially in On Human Physiognomy, a very popular treatise at the time, is going to relate to different characteristics of animals. So therefore, if you looked like a lion with a mane, with this large, deeply undercut locks of hair, then you would have been a warrior and a great leader. Thus, of course, David would be a future king and warrior. Now, this is going to be common since antiquity, and the theories of physiognomy, that being how we look, is going to be informative of our internal character, is going to be the same. And so Alexander the Great, famously, is going to only allow his portrait to be made by Lysippus, is going to be shown in a leonine physiognomy with a very large mane of hair to show that he is a great warrior. Turning to his early benefactors, we have, against his will later on in his life, Michelangelo working for the Medici once again, creating what is now known as the new sacristy and part of this new monument to the Medici dukes in their parish church of San Lorenzo. Here, to differentiate it from Filippo Brunelleschi's old sacristy to the left, we have in red highlighted here the new sacristy designed by Michelangelo to be a burial chapel, posthumously deciding that the Medici dukes are now going to claim the title of duke, in which, of course, they did not have the right to do so earlier because they were not aristocrats. Now, this complexity in spatial arrangement and comportment can also be seen in Michelangelo's own work, who, by the 15 teens, is going to be contorting his figures more and more radically until we get to the figures in the Medici chapel that eventually will contort and twist in every conceivable direction, thus giving us the Renaissance adage of the perfect figure looking like an upward licking flame. Now, the Medici are, by the first quarter of the 16th century, going to proclaim that they are the Grand Dukes of Tuscany, the first one being Cosimo I. And in order to highlight their noble lineage, Cosimo I and later Grand Dukes will commission chapels like this, glorifying their ancestors, specifically Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici, who are going to live in the latter part of the 15th century. Turning our eyes heavenward, we can see that, as in most burial chapels, and also meant to make one think of the old sacristy designed by Brunelleschi, we have a series of circles and squares as we ascend upward, transitioning from the square representing the earth and death to the promise of salvation and resurrection above in the heavens, represented by the circle. Here, they're going to be shown in ancient all'antica visages dressed as Roman soldiers or generals, holding batons of power and or contemplating life as a philosopher. So therefore, we have Giuliano de' Medici, who's going to be shown as a general with a baton on the left. And then Lorenzo, given that he is the philosopher, is shown in quiet contemplation on the right. The figures in front of them, leaning on sarcophagi because they're buried here, are going to be allegories of the different times of day, the 4 times of day, specifically night and day on the left and dusk and dawn on the right. Now, these figures, very importantly, will be copied ad nauseum by different artists throughout Europe for the next 200 years at least. The figure of Giuliano de' Medici, wearing an ancient Roman cuirass or chest plate, which would protect him in battle, and then, of course, an ancient or all'antica grotesque on his chest as well, carries the baton of power in his lap as he twists off, looking dramatically to his left, just as David had, that Michelangelo had carved and sits in front of the Palazzo Vecchio at this time, and is about to push off with his left leg in a twisting contrapposto spiraling fashion, much like Michelangelo's Moses does, the powerful form that we might imagine at any moment could leap into action. That is what is suggested here. But even more so, given that Michelangelo is entering a Mannerist phase, you'll notice that the twisting forms and the graceful spring-like organization of this contrapposto pose is going to be coupled with an elongated neck, an attenuation of gracefulness that is not natural and does not conform to the anatomy practiced by the artist and tried to capture earlier in the century. More and more, this graceful elongation becomes common for Michelangelo. No more so can the contortion common to Mannerist art be seen than in his allegories for the Medici Chapel, specifically in the figures of night and day, where you have an old woman and an old man, in which you find that night, representing the end of one's life, is going to have an owl, right, a nocturnal animal, her breasts sag. She is going to be twisting the lower part of her body as her legs move off to her right, whereas she moves her right arm up to rest on her left leg as her torso faces to her left. Thus, the lower part of the body twists in the opposite position and direction as the upper part of the body. So we get this maximum contortion and this contorted effect with a graceful, twisting, spiraling form as this allegory of night falls asleep. The opposite is true of her male counterpart, Day, a virile, middle-aged man who is incredibly muscular, who twists the upper part of his torso and arms to his left, looking dramatically over his shoulder to the right, while his legs are crossed also dramatically to the right. So again, we have a figure whose body is moving in opposite directions, thus giving us a wonderful contrapposto, even in a seated form, where all of the weight and the visual weight will be twisting to one side, thus counterbalancing it with the upper part of the torso. Next today, we have Night, this allegorical figure shown as an older woman with sagging breasts and an owl between her legs. She crosses over very dramatically her right arm across her left leg, showing the maximum amount of contortion that Michelangelo so appreciated in this later Mannerist phase of his career. She has, of course, a semicircular lunette on her crown, identifying her as the end or death. Here we have a detail showing exactly how Michelangelo's female nudes very much are different from others like Raphael and Titian's in the period. For you'll notice that the pectoral muscles and the anatomy are that of a male, and he merely is going to append to that female breasts. We find on the other side, we have here the other Medici Duke, contemplatively lost in thought. Thus, the two represent together the contemplative and the active life. So here we have that of a philosopher. Below him, we have dusk, which of course is going to be twilight, and this figure who's crossing over his right leg over his left, while he looks back, twisting very abruptly to his left towards the figure behind him, and that is dawn. Now, dawn, of course, representing rebirth and new life, just like the goddess of dawn, Aurora, in classical myth. We have a figure that is youthful, who, of course, is going to be open to the viewer, who turns towards us. Thus, of course, we have fecundity and fertility related here, unlike the closed-off version of Night, who is going to be closing off and representing death. Dawn here represents new life. Now, the High Renaissance lasts from 1500 to 1520 and is over with the death of Raphael at that time. It is identified by its classicizing and idealizing balance in its composition and its figures, and the rational approach to compositions. Now, this gives way to much more confused and spasmodic ones that we just discussed.
So, in summation, Mannerism is the Catholic response to Protestantism, that being what is happening in Europe at the time after 1517 with the advent of Protestantism and 1527 with the sack of Rome, the heart of Catholicism. So this is their response, in which there is no longer a blind faith in our ability to control our destinies, our world, and certainly not the afterlife in our souls. So we see this anxiety carried out in a complexity of narrative, of spatial organization, of compositional arrangement, which returns to Gothic characteristics such as stacking, such as graceful elegance, such as arbitrary color choices that are going to be pastel and very beautiful and elegant, yet not rational, logical, and clear. So finally, at the end of the century, we see in the second generation of Mannerist artists, these erudite themes are going to be designed and intended for an elite audience who would have seen all of these great works throughout Europe, and thus, through interpictoriality, could identify what types of works are being referenced, thus showing their cultured education and how superior they were through the self-referentiality of works of art.
After watching this lecture in the documentary, don't forget to take the next quiz. Next time, we will continue on with late art in Florence, Mannerism, and the very man you've been reading who wrote the biographies of these great artists, Giorgio Vasari.